Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is John Hancock. He is a World War II veteran, a U.S. Navy veteran. He was a gunner on board the USS Yorktown during the pivotal Battle of Midway in June of 1942, as the Allies seized momentum in the Pacific that would last throughout the rest of the war. And Mr. Hancock, thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Let's start with the beginning of your story. Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in South Georgia, North Florida. I was born August the 10th, 1924, if you can believe. Graduated from high school in Georgia and joined the Navy October the 27th, which used to be Navy Day, I guess it still is, 1941. And there were 316 of us from that area that joined the Navy that day. And we went to Norfolk for our boot training. Graduated December 5th, 1941 in Norfolk, and Japanese changed our minds on 2 days later, and went aboard the Yorktown, CV-5, on the following week. It was in dry dock in Newport News, and we got underway a few days later and went around through the Florida Straits, through the canal up to San Diego. Had a few days there, got there right after Christmas. We left San Diego and convoyed the Samoa Battalion of Marines and their material. Dropped them off. Of course, we didn't go in because being on a carrier, we didn't go into foreign ports, although Samoa was America Samoa. The Japanese were running rampant, so we didn't know what was going to happen or anything, and so we left there and we went out to sea, and over the horizon came another battle fleet in addition to ours. We had 6 destroyers and 2 cruisers plus our carrier, the Yorktown, and ours. And in this battle fleet, it turned out, was commanded by, later to become famous, William F. Halsey, or they called him Bull to his back. And he took off and landed on the Yorktown. Had a pilot fly him, although he was a pilot himself. And he and our admiral, Admiral Fletcher, got their heads together without our permission, of course, and decided to bomb the Japanese. So the first retaliatory strike of the war, coordinated battle fleet, was done in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands by the Enterprise and her battle group, and the Yorktown and our battle group. We left there and went to Pearl Harbor, our first time there, and there for a few days, took it on supplies and refueled and all that stuff. Then we left there and went down to the Coral Sea. The Japanese had bombed Townsend in northern Australia, and they were trying to invade Port Moresby, New Guinea, and we joined the old Lexington, and we ran back into, and then we bumped into the Japanese, and they bumped into us, and we had the first carrier battle in the history of the world, called the Battle of the Coral Sea, on May the 8th, 1942. We just celebrated that in New York with the Australian survivors. The Lexington was sunk, and we took a couple of bombs. And my good friends in the Marine Corps like to tell you that the Marines were first ashore in the Solomon Islands on Guadalcanal. Turned out that 2 of our fighter planes, Johnny Adams and Scott McCuskey, was over strafing and carrying on the island of Tulagi with our dive bombers. They took a hit in the gas tank, McCluskey did, and so they landed on the beach at Guadalcanal. There's nobody there. And Adams landed behind him. So the Navy beat our good buddies the Marines by a few days. Anyway, we sent a destroyer in to pick them up, and we launched 3 times that day and bombed Tulagi. The Japanese were landed in force. That tipped the Japanese off that America was there with a carrier or 2, and so in the next couple of days we joined forces and had what was called the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Lexington was sunk, and we took a couple of bomb hits, and we left and came back to Pearl flank speed, because Admiral Nimitz had told our admiral, Admiral Fletcher, to bust her to Pearl. And we left an oil slick all the way because the Japs had opened the seam. We went into Pearl Harbor, went around Fort Island, and right into dry dock. And, of course, just being a kid seaman, I just heard the scuttlebutt, but they said that Nimitz told the yard workers to have that ship out of there in 72 hours. He knew about the Japs coming to Midway. So they sent all us kids ashore to get us out of the way, I guess. And the people that knew what they were doing went to work round the clock. So in the 72 hours, they flooded the dry dock, and we backed out and went to sea. And between Oahu and Molokai, we recovered airplanes. And we went to a place that they had designated as Point Luck, which is approximately 150 miles northeast of Midway Island. And we sat there and waited on the Japs. We got there about June the 1st, or the 2nd, and then on June the 4th, our PBYs located the Jap fleet, 6 carriers, and their accompanying escorts. So I happened to be a sky lookout, and I was right over the wing of the bridge, and I could hear the admiral talking to the captain the morning of June the 4th. And the captain came out and said, Admiral, the PBYs have located part of the Jap fleet. They reported 2 carriers. Admiral says, well, let's just wait till they give us a better fix. And pretty soon there was another report that they had found the main fleet or some such thing. And then I heard the admiral tell the captain to signal Enterprise, who had the other admiral on there that was junior to Admiral Fletcher, tell them to launch 2 deck loads, everything they got, off the Enterprise and the Hornet. And we will follow as soon as we recover our scouts. We had the scout duty that morning. And so they took off, and pretty soon our scouts hove into view, and we recovered them. And so we sent off our battlefield, our dive bombers and torpedo planes and fighters. And the way it turned out, the Enterprise, McCluskey, spotted a Jap destroyer and followed it to the Japanese fleet. That destroyer was a Jap destroyer which is keeping one of our subs down that had got in there. And it paid off. He got there, and it just so happened that the Yorktown attack force got there at the same time. So they sank 4 of their carriers, 3 of their carriers, and it's important to note that the reason they only had 4 carriers at Midway is because we sank one and heavily damaged 2 others, because they had 6 in their battle fleet that had bombed Pearl Harbor on December the 7th. But anyway, they missed one that was under a rain cloud. They came back to the ship, and the Japanese followed them, and they attacked us, and they dropped a bomb down our stack and one on the flight deck, where I got wounded and knocked out. But it stopped us, and we were dead in the water for about a little over an hour, and they finally got the boilers back online, and we got underway, and the radar reported unidentified aircraft approaching from the west, and so our fighters went out to intercept, and the Enterprise fighters went out to intercept, and what was left of the Hornet went out. You see, the Hornet squadrons got lost. They splashed in the water. Some made it to Midway, and some made it back. But they had sent our planes over to land on the Enterprise and the Hornet. The Japanese came in their torpedo planes, and they dropped torpedoes on us. I was firing at them like everybody else was. Questionable whether we hit anything or not, but anyway, they dropped 2 torpedoes that hit us back on the port quarter, and that stopped us again, and we were listed way over the port. Captain ordered us to abandon ship, so we did. And our planes that were on the Enterprise and Hornet went with what they had left and found that fourth carrier and sank it. So we sank all their carriers. The important thing is we hadn't sank that one and heavily damaged the other two that were at Pearl Harbor. They had 6. As I said before, there would have been 6 carriers up there. So that kind of helped matters, I guess. So we abandoned ship, and I went over the port side. The flight deck was dipping in the water, and I got lost from everybody else, my kind of luck. I found myself all alone. The ocean has currents like in the air, and I got caught in one because we were taking the wounded and putting those life biscuits, we call them, a round thing, putting the wounded in there and holding on, but more guys kept coming, and I weighed 130 pounds. They elbowed me off, and so I found myself all alone. It was getting dark, and I had on an old Kapok life jacket, and I had a tab hanging out, and I looked down at it. It said flotation assured for 12 hours, and it was getting dark, and I'd been in the water a couple of hours by then. So just before it got too dark, this destroyer, and I'll never forget it if I live to be 1,000, said DD 411, turned out to be the USS Anderson. So they put me on a mess table down in the mess hall, and they found I had shrapnel in my right leg and neck. But anyway, they took care of that. The next day, they transferred us underway to the heavy cruiser Portland in coal bags, and we stayed on her overnight. And the next day, the USS Fulton, a subtender, had come out from Pearl, took us all aboard, and we went to Pearl Harbor.
Sir, let's pause right there. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back with John Hancock, World War II U.S. Navy veteran, on Veterans Chronicles. We are back on Veterans Chronicles on the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Columbus, and I'm joined today by John Hancock. He is a veteran of World War II. The U.S. Navy, served as a gunner on the Yorktown. And, sir, you were just explaining the harrowing story of abandoning ship when the Yorktown was repeatedly torpedoed during the Battle of Midway, and you were ultimately picked up by a destroyer. What's going through your mind as you're floating in the water during that time?
Well, of course, I'm anxious for somebody to come and pull me out of that. You get awfully cold because you get soaked with water, and you're way out to sea. I was hoping somebody would come by, and they did. And so I think we had gotten to the place where they transferred us underway from the heavy cruiser Portland to the Fulton and went into Pearl Harbor. And the Navy sent the whole crew down to a little place on Oahu called Nanakula. Actually, we were almost like prisoners of war because the Navy, America, did not want the Japanese to know that we were sunk. And so we just had a lot of fun playing in the surf and what have you. And while down there, I was an expert at some things like picking up cigarette butts and stuff like that, and raking. So they had me out doing my expertise. And this fellow I was working with, another sailor, asked me if I felt all right. And I said, of course. I said, why? He said, because your lips are purple. No kidding. I looked at my fingernails, and they were just black. So they had a corpsman in a little dispensary there, and I went in there, and he checked my vitals and loaded me in a Jeep and carried me into the hospital in Pearl Harbor, where they found that my right lung had collapsed, and there was a lack of oxygen. So they kept me in for about a week under what they call a pull motor, an oxygen tent. And then the Hammond crew, this destroyer Hammond was alongside the Yorktown. They had sent a salvage crew back to her, and this Japanese submarine came under the screen and fired a fan of 4 fish, torpedoes. 2 of them ran completely under both ships, and one hit the Hammond and one hit the Yorktown. And Yorktown was listed heavy to port, and that kind of almost righted her a little bit. But the Hammond went down immediately, and her depth charges went off, catching all these guys in the water. And they suffered terribly. Most of them died. So they moved me out of the main hospital across the street. And it just so happened the Navy doctor was from Georgia, And so we got along famously. He said, besides, I'd planning on moving you anyway to take your tonsils out. And then I really suffered, because back in those days they didn't have all the wherewithal. So anyway, I was there about a week, and then they bundled me up and let me come home on survivor's leave. So I got home to Georgia in time for my 18th birthday. So that ended the saga of the Yorktown, and when my leave was up, I had to go back to San Francisco, where I went through some training, what have you, and then they sent me to sea in a brand spanking new ship, an old transport. We went to Pearl, and then we loaded up some Marines and went down and invaded Saipan and the Marianas. And we came back to Pearl, loaded up again, and went back down and invaded Tinian. And then came back again, and by that time we were all ready to invade Peleliu with the 1st Marine Division, which we did. And then we returned to Pearl Harbor and refurbished and what have you, and we went down and became part of MacArthur's Navy. We invaded Leyte October the 20th, 1944. And an interesting note about that was they sent me over to Hollandia. MacArthur had a big home built on this big high mesa at Hollandia, New Guinea. They sent me up there. I didn't see him, but this Army colonel and Navy captain said, we want you to go back to your ship and make room for, I forget, 8 or 10 people. They're VIPs. I'd never heard that word before. And so I asked him, he said, it means very important people. I said, who are they? He said, none of your business. So I said, where are we going? He said, none of your business. So I did. I went back and I got the chief steward to set up some rooms and arrange for the feeding. It turned out to be President Sergio Osmeña of the Philippine Commonwealth, General Romulo of the Philippine Scouts, and Lieutenant Ramirez, who was a Filipino pilot, Army pilot, had flown them out when the Japs were closing in on Manila. So we took off, and on October the 20th, we went into Leyte Harbor and dropped the anchor, and we were firing at the beach along with every other ship. And this LCVP, landing craft vehicular personnel, came alongside, and old Dugout Doug himself came up the gangway. And I directed him to the captain's cabin. That's where we put the president. He never even spoke to me, naturally. I was a nobody. But anyway, he took the president and his entourage over to invade Leyte, and they waded ashore. And if you see that picture of MacArthur wading ashore, the little guy on his right with the pith helmet is President Osmeña.
Okay.
Anyway, they got, and so we went back and we unloaded cargo, ammunition, and all kind of supplies, and also used our 5-inch 38s to bombard the beach whenever the Army called for it. About dark, we were getting underway to go back down to Hollandia. And we'd also found out the Japanese fleet was coming down the slot, and they didn't want my type of ship in the way. And they sent the old battleships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor out to intercept the Japanese. And for the first time in the history of the Navy, which the Navy has been trying to do since the beginning of it, navies, they crossed the T. In other words, about these old wagons, the Jap fleet was coming down more or less single file. They crossed that sea, and what that meant that all guns could bear on them, and they could only fire their forward guns. So here's all these 16-inch guns, and each shell weighs 2,300 pounds, 9 at a time, and then just tore the Japanese fleet up something. And what survived turned tail and left. And anyway, here's this boat that came up alongside, and I was on watch on the bridge, and I had one of these little bullhorns, and I asked, "What's your orders, Coxswain?" He said, "I have General MacArthur and his staff aboard, and they wish to come aboard." And so I told them to stand by. I went over on the port side and told the captain, and he said, "Tell them we're getting underway to dodge this Japanese battle fleet." And I could see them talking down there. General Kruger, General MacArthur, and all of them. And all of a sudden they went like this. They had changed their mind, so they went to the heavy cruiser Nashville. I found out later. We got underway, and we didn't see any Japs. We went back down to Hollandia. Only this time we went to Adapi, New Guinea, and got a load of troops and stuff and came back.
Sir, let me pause you right there. We'll be right back on Veterans Chronicles. We're back on Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Columbus, honored to be joined today by Mr. John Hancock. He is a World War II and U.S. Navy veteran, served on the Yorktown, and as we've described, several ships after that as a result of the loss of the Yorktown at the Battle of Midway. And, sir, you were just talking about returning to New Guinea after...
Yes. We returned to Adapi, New Guinea for more troops and supplies, and went back to Leyte and put them ashore. Then we invaded Mindoro, and then Lingayen Gulf on Luzon, and put MacArthur ashore there. So then we were released, and we went back to the Solomon Islands, to the island of Pavuvu, and loaded up the 1st Marine Division and invaded Peleliu. I got relieved to go to flight school in Norman, Oklahoma, Navy pre-flight and then flight school. And I came back to sea. I was assigned on the fighter squadron flying F-6F Hellcats on the old Saratoga. And then we were dispersed to other ships as they needed us, and we invaded Okinawa, Iwo Jima first, and we had it pretty much secured when we hit Okinawa. Well, that brought the whole Japanese Air Force down, old biplanes and every kind of thing they could fly. They called themselves kamikaze, divine wind. There were a lot of aces made because it's like stabbing guppies in a barrel with a salad fork, because they just didn't have it. They were taught enough to fly and land, and that was it. So it was kind of fun to shoot them down. Anyway,
let me pause you right there, because I want to get into a little bit about your role as a gunner. Talk about that, and not only shooting down kamikazes, but the training, the expertise, and what that entailed as a gunner.
I was trained to fire the .50 caliber machine gun when I was in the deck force, and there's nothing to that except you have to lead. And I grew up in the South where we shoot quail and doves, like I said earlier, and anything else that moved. So we learned to lead things. So that's the thing you do in the air. So you learn to lead a guy so he'll fly in. So in flying the Hellcat, the F-6F, we could outrun the Zero for the first time. The Zero used to sucker our guys in the early part of the war in a vertical climb. And they learned in a hurry. If our guys in the old Wildcat tried to follow them, they'd stall out, and the Jap sitting up there watching you, and then when you stall out, he's down on top of you. So the Hellcat could follow him. So anyway, as time went by, they dropped the atom bomb, and when they did that, I was en route with a bunch of other fellows to Kaneohe Naval Air Station on Oahu in the Hawaiian Islands to transition to F-4U Corsairs. And while there, we were on the old Sarah. While there, I was laying in my bunk trying to sleep, and all hell broke loose. I thought the Japanese were bombing Pearl Harbor again, so I went topside. They was firing shrapnel and tracers and carrying on. I said, "What the world's going on?" They said the war's ended, and the Navy and the Marines and Army just went nuts in Hawaii. They were taking people's cars and climbing telephone poles and all kind of things. So a few days went by, and I got orders to come home. So I wanted to get home as soon as I could and get in school, because I only had a high school education then. So I came home on the Sarah. We came home and picked up a bunch of fellas, took all the planes off. They brought all these bunks ashore and put them on a hangar deck, and put what the early porter led up on the flight deck with a thing that you put it over the side, hanging off the stern. Went into Frisco, and the tugs were blowing water, and people, tugboats blowing, everybody having a great time. Made us feel great, we were home. Climbed on a train, and I had a draft of 14 guys, and I was a chief petty officer then. And another chief and I were in charge of this draft, bunch of white hats, and they didn't give a darn if we were admirals. They weren't paying attention to us, and they took over our stateroom, played poker and smoked all the way to Charleston, South Carolina, where we got discharged. And I went home, and my dad, who went to the University of Georgia, got me on a train. We went down there, and they couldn't take me because they had a quarter system and it already started, and suggested I go to South Carolina because they have a semester system, and so that's why I wound up at Clemson. And like everybody else, we put that war out of our mind, tried to forget it, went out and raised families, got jobs, and climbed over one another's backs to succeed in life, and here I am.
You tell your story so eloquently, yet from what I've read, you were very reluctant to talk about it for many years.
Yeah, all the veterans were. We wouldn't talk about it. While down at Clemson, it turned out that a whole bunch of Patton's tankers and the guys in the Battle of the Bulge was there. And they got a hold of some old Quincy huts left over when they were training people during the war. And back in those days, all the professors had milk cows and chickens. Some guy found a big old cook pot that you boil hogs in, I guess. And they'd put up a sign that says, "Corporate and graduate, bring a chicken from home." And in the meantime, all night long you could hear chickens squawking because these guys had learned to live off the land, and they were catching all these old teachers' chickens. And it cost 50 cents a night or $5 a week paid in advance to stay there. And so we were able to save money over the dormitories that way. So a lot of those guys became judges and doctors and what have you, and I became an engineer and worked for AT&T. They got rich and I starved to death.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the significance of what you witnessed. First of all, you said the first carrier battle you were part of. What was it like being in combat for the first time? You talked about, obviously, you shot guns as a young boy, and in the South, you obviously went through training, but when it actually got time for battle, what was it like?
Well, you've heard the saying that war is a young man's game, and I guess it's because you don't really have brains enough to really get scared, even though you are scared. I remember when they said commence fire, and the big guns went off first, and we could see our fighter planes shooting down the other planes. You see them streaming down. And so I just got ready, and I was on the bow then, on the forecastle. And when they got close to the end range, I opened up on them, and it was just like quail hunting. Now, I didn't think about getting hurt. And when it was over, I remember my loader saying, "My God, the lifelines are cut right behind me." There was a near miss, the shrapnel cut the lifelines right behind me. And that made me stop and think a minute. But it was over, and since we won, we were slapping one another on the back like a football game and everything, and hey, we won. And so then we calmed down till we got to Midway, and it started all over again, but they moved me back so I'd have a bigger field of fire. I guess they thought I was shooting pretty good. I don't know where I was or not, because there's so much shrapnel and tracers in the air, you can't tell. They're shooting back at you and everything. Mm-hmm. But at Midway, they put me on the after end of the island structure so I could have a bigger field of fire. So I was there, and they would shoot at the dive bombers and the torpedo planes especially. They came in right on the port quarter and just kept coming. Every ship in the fleet was firing at them, and you could barely see them to shoot at them. And they dropped torpedoes, and two of them hit us. And so that was kind of nervous. And I walked down the ladder to the flight deck to go forward to abandon ship. And all these plane handlers, the guys that push plane up down the deck, respot them. they had sat on that ladder during the battle. They didn't have anything to do, and I had to walk on them going down, and a bomb that had hit the deck and just decimated them. You had no choice to get down. You had to step on them. And gosh, kind of bad. But other than that, you just went forward, went over the side. That's what you're supposed to do, you know.
The very early part of the Pacific War obviously went very badly, from Pearl Harbor to the surrender of the Philippines, yet you were part of the effort at the Coral Sea, which kind of stopped the bleeding at least, and then Midway reversed the momentum. So what does it mean to you to be part of those momentous parts of history?
Well, they tell us it was a real game changer, as they say nowadays. It turned out, from what the news was, that Roosevelt made a deal with Churchill at Europe first. So we were fighting on a shoestring. And we had these old carriers that had been built before the war. The Yorktown and the Enterprise was the newest ones, and then came the Hornet and the Wasp. But the Saratoga and the Lexington were old pocket battle cruisers. They had converted because of that treaty, worldwide naval treaty. And so they made those carriers. And we had these old slow airplanes, like the TBD that they used. Last time it was used at Midway, and everybody got shot down practically. Slow, and had a pop gun, 30 caliber in the nose, and then the rear gunner had a twin 30s. So we were really fighting with our backs against the wall, and everybody was asleep at the switch. They let the Japs come into the Philippines. Now, funny thing about they bombed Pearl Harbor on the 7th. MacArthur had 24 hours notice, and he had a general came in and told him that the Japanese on that Taiwan were loaded up, bombs and baggage, and they were going to come down, and we had a big deterrent there, B-17s and B-24s, that they were coming. And he says, I am loaded and ready to go, and I can catch them on the ground. MacArthur says, no, let's wait till we hear from Washington. So the next day they wiped out all his deterrents. So that's what you get, I guess, if you don't teach the right courses at West Point and Annapolis. But that's what happened, and so from then on, we were just hit and run until we hit them head on at Midway and at Coral Sea. Mm-hmm. And the Coral Sea was the first carrier battle, like I said, in the history of the world, and then Midway was a turning point. And we were lucky on that because the Hornets crews got lost. So we only had what was on the Enterprise and the Yorktown. And the Solomon Islands, they were sinking our ships like no tomorrow. In fact, we call that bay Iron Bottom Bay down there because they sank so many of our ships until we kind of turned the table and began to sink theirs. So we were fighting with our back against the wall. And they came out with an improved aircraft, and they took jerks like me, and they needed cannon fodder and sent us to pilot training. And so by the time the war ended, we had a Navy as big as the whole world's Navy, I guess. And there were 50,000 personnel in the Navy when the war started. I read that someplace. I mean, what do I know, you know? So it was rough out there, I can tell you that.
Wow. Did you realize at the time the significance of the battles?
Not when you're 17 years old. All you understand is when chow time comes and taps and liberty. That's about it.
We've been joined today by U.S. Navy and World War II veteran John Hancock on Veterans Chronicles.